The moment Myrtle Ramsey stepped down from the stagecoach into the blazing Arizona sun of 1878, she was already bracing herself for a man who wouldn't notice she existed. That was what everyone had told her, after all. Back in Missouri, where the arrangement had been made through correspondence and careful letters, and a sum of money exchanged between her father and a rancher named Amos Stone, the women who knew anything about the territory had pulled her aside one by one. Her aunt had pressed her hands and said, "That Stone fellow, they say he doesn't look at people, doesn't speak much either. You'll be living like a ghost out there, girl." The postmaster's wife had been even less kind about it. "Married to a man like that, you'll grow old invisible." Her own mother had simply cried, which in its own way said everything. So Myrtle had boarded the stagecoach in late September with 2 worn leather trunks, a hat box, a Bible, and every expectation of marrying a man who would walk past her in his own kitchen without a word. She was 23 years old. She had brown hair that curled stubbornly at her temples no matter what she did to it, green eyes that her mother called her best feature and her brother called unsettling, and a manner that people in Caldwell, Missouri, described as sensible. She was not beautiful in the way that men wrote poems about. She was not plain either. She was simply herself, solidly present in the world, and she had decided somewhere around the second day of the stagecoach journey through the dry red hills that she would not spend her married life feeling invisible. Whatever Amos Stone was, she would make herself known. The town of Harrow Creek, Arizona Territory, was smaller than she had imagined. One long main street of weathered timber buildings, a saloon with a broken sign, a general store, a livery, a church that needed painting, and about 30 people who had apparently all decided to be somewhere near the stagecoach stop at precisely this moment. They were watching her with open curiosity, the way frontier people watched anything new arrive, which was with the combined energy of people who hadn't had entertainment in several weeks. Myrtle straightened her traveling coat, lifted her chin, and looked around for a man she had never met. She found him immediately, though she hadn't known she was looking. He was standing apart from the crowd, leaning against the post of the livery stable across the street with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested not just size but real work, the kind of frame built by years of hauling and lifting and pushing against the land itself. His jaw was dark with several days of beard. His clothes were clean but worn, the way working clothes get when they're tended to but never bobbied. He wasn't shouting her name or waving or smiling like the other men who'd come to collect wives and sisters. He was just watching her, not the crowd, not the stagecoach, not the other passengers gathering their things. His eyes were pale beneath the shadow of his hat brim, and they had not moved from her face since the moment she stepped down, and they did not move now even as she stared back, which she was doing quite openly because she had been raised with enough directness to return a gaze. A woman beside her, round-faced and cheerful and carrying a basket of eggs, leaned close and said, "That's Amos Stone, honey. He's been standing there since before the stage came in." Myrtle said, "He was told I was arriving today." "Oh, sure," the woman said. "But see, he came into town 3 hours early. Folks noticed. He never comes into town before he has to." She paused. "He's still looking at you." "I noticed," Myrtle said. She picked up her hat box, squared her shoulders, and walked across the street toward him. He didn't move as she approached. He watched her come the whole way across the packed dirt of the street, through the small scatter of chickens and the dust raised by the stagecoach pulling on, all the way to within 5 feet of him, where she stopped and looked up at him properly. Up close he was even more striking than he'd appeared from a distance, and not in any way she had been equipped to prepare for. His face was weathered in the way the territory itself was weathered, a kind of rugged beauty that came from living honestly in a hard landscape. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes, his jaw was strong, and those pale eyes, gray like creek water in winter, were fixed on her with an intensity that was not at all what she'd been told to expect from a man who supposedly ignored everyone. "Mr. Stone," she said. "Miss Ramsey," he said. His voice was low and even not unkind. "I'm told you don't speak much," she said, because she had decided to say exactly what she thought. Something shifted in his expression. It was small, barely there, but she caught it because she was watching carefully. The very corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "I speak when there's something worth saying," he said. "I suppose we'll find out if I qualify," she said. He looked at her for another long moment, and then he uncrossed his arms and pushed away from the post and reached down and picked up one of her trunks from where the stagecoach driver had set it in the dust. "Wagons behind the livery," he said. That was all. He turned and carried her trunk around the corner, and she followed him, because what else was there to do? And because in the space of 3 minutes, Amos Stone had already defied every single thing she had been told about him. The ride out to the Stone Ranch took the better part of an hour through country that was beautiful in the savage, indifferent way of the Arizona Territory in autumn. The red rock formations rose against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at directly. Scrub and sage covered the flats, and a line of cottonwoods in the distance marked a creek that wound through the property. Myrtle sat on the wagon bench beside Amos and watched it all and said nothing for the first few miles, because she was genuinely awestruck, and because she was also simply thinking. He drove with the ease of a man who had made this journey 10,000 times. His hands on the reins were steady and unhurried. He hadn't said a word since they left Harrow Creek, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence she associated with people who were at peace with the world around them, who didn't feel the need to fill air with sound just to prove they were present. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, when the initial wonder of the landscape had settled a little. 12 years, he said. "Started with 60 acres, got 400 now." "You built it yourself?" "Started myself. Hired on 2 hands about 4 years ago." He glanced at her sideways. "Brothers, named Clem and Dutch Pharaoh, good workers. Clem talks enough for all 3 of us." She smiled at that. "I'll look forward to meeting them." He nodded slightly, eyes back on the trail. "The house," he said a moment later, "it's not what you might be used to." "I grew up on a farm in Missouri," she said. "I'm not expecting a hotel." "It's clean," he said. "I made sure of that." Something about the way he said it, the quiet weight of those 3 words, told her he had actually done something about the state of his house in preparation for her arrival, had perhaps worked at it, and that it mattered to him what she found when she got there. She filed that away carefully. The ranch house was a solid, low-built structure of adobe and timber at the base of a long red slope, with a wide porch and 2 outbuildings and a barn that was frankly impressive in its size and order. There were horses in the corral, 5 of them, beautiful animals that came to the fence when the wagon rolled in. The yard was swept. The porch had no clutter. She could see from here that the windows were clean. A young man came jogging out of the barn the moment the wagon stopped, wiping his hands on his jeans, grinning widely. He was maybe 20, with sandy hair and freckles and the kind of face that had never learned to hide a single thought. "Miss Ramsey," he announced as though she might not know who she was. "I'm Clem Pharaoh. We are real glad you've come, ma'am, real glad. The boss has been—" He stopped himself at what appeared to be some reflexive instinct of self-preservation, and his eyes cut sideways to Amos. "Well, we're just glad." "Thank you, Clem," she said warmly. "I'm glad to be here." A second young man appeared from the barn behind Clem, moving with less noise and more restraint. He was perhaps a year or 2 older than his brother, darker-haired, quieter-eyed. He tipped his hat. "Dutch Pharaoh, ma'am. Welcome to Stone Ranch." "Thank you," she said. Amos had already climbed down and was lifting her trunks from the wagon bed. He carried both of them to the porch without apparent effort and set them down with care. "I'll show you the house," he said. The inside was exactly what he'd promised. Clean, simply furnished, smelling of wood smoke and pine soap, and something she identified after a moment as dried lavender, which surprised her. The main room had a fireplace, a table with 4 chairs, a wood stove in the kitchen corner with a proper Dutch oven, and a set of iron pots hanging neatly on the wall. The floor was swept hard-packed earth with 2 braided rugs. There were 2 real glass windows, which was more than she'd expected. He showed her to the bedroom, which was small and spare, with a frame bed, a washstand, a narrow dresser, and curtains on the window. The curtains were new. She could see that by the crispness of the fabric, the way they hadn't yet softened from light and washing. She touched them lightly. "Did you make these?" He was standing in the doorway with his arms at his sides, looking at her in that steady, unguarded way he seemed to have. "Bought them from Mrs. Aldrich in town," he said. "Last week." She turned and looked at him. "You bought new curtains for my room." "Your room while we're—" He stopped, cleared his throat. They weren't married yet. That was a fact of their arrangement. He had corresponded with her father, a formal arrangement had been made, and she had come out here with the understanding that they would be married, but the actual ceremony had not yet happened. "While you're settling in," he finished. "When is the wedding planned?" she asked, direct as always. "Saturday, if you're willing. Reverend Collins comes through Harrow Creek on Saturdays." "That's 3 days," she said. "It is." He met her eyes. "If you need more time, I can write to the Reverend." She studied him. She thought about the way he had stood at the livery stable 3 hours before the stage arrived, and watched her step down from it. She thought about the clean windows and the new curtains and the Dutch oven and the dried lavender that someone had thought to put in a kitchen where a woman was coming to live. "Saturday is fine," she said. Something passed through his pale eyes. Relief, she thought. He was relieved. And then he gave her the briefest nod and said he'd see to the horses and left her to settle in. And Myrtle Ramsey stood in the middle of the small, clean bedroom with the new curtains and felt the first real warmth of something she hadn't dared to name yet stir quietly in her chest. The next 3 days were a kind of careful dance, and Myrtle found herself enjoying every step of it more than she had any right to expect. She learned the rhythms of the ranch quickly, because she was the kind of woman who paid attention. The days started before dawn, when Amos rose without sound and went out to the horses, and she would rise shortly after and start the kitchen fire and make coffee strong enough to hold up a spoon. The first morning she did this, she heard him come back through the door and stop in the kitchen and be very still for a moment. And when she turned around with 2 cups, he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It was too quiet for surprise and too warm for something ordinary. "Coffee," she said, offering him a cup. He took it. Their fingers didn't touch but came close. "Thank you," he said. It became the rhythm of every morning after that without either of them discussing it. She met the full life of the ranch over those days. She learned that Amos ran a cattle operation with a herd of about 200 longhorns grazing the back pastures, and that he also bred horses, which was clearly his true passion. She could see it in the way he moved among the animals in the corral, the quiet authority of a man who understood something deeply and cared about it beyond its commercial value. She also learned that the silence she had been warned about was nothing like what she'd been led to believe. Amos Stone did not talk constantly, it was true. He had no interest in filling space with empty conversation, but he was not mute and he was not cold. When he spoke, he said things that mattered. When she asked him questions, he answered them fully and honestly. When something amused him, she could see it in his eyes before it reached the slight curve of his mouth, and she started looking for those small signals with a concentration that surprised her. On the second afternoon, she walked out to the corral while he was working with a young bay horse, a mare that was clearly still learning to trust handling, and she leaned on the top rail and watched. Amos moved around the horse with a patience that was almost extraordinary, never rushing, never forcing, simply being present and consistent until the mare began to soften into it. It took the better part of an hour before the horse stood quiet under his hand, and he stroked her neck once briefly and stepped away. He noticed Myrtle at the fence then and walked over. "She's beautiful," Myrtle said. "Skittish," he said. "Had a bad handler before I got her." "Takes time to convince them the world isn't always going to hurt," She looked at him. He was looking at the horse, not at her, but the words sat between them with a weight that she suspected he intended even if he would never say it outright. "You're good at that," she said. "The patience." He turned to look at her then. "You watched for a long time. I wanted to understand what I was seeing." He held her gaze for a moment. "And did you?" She considered her answer. "I think so," she said. He nodded, just slightly, and something in the set of his shoulders changed, loosened by some small but real degree, as though he had been carrying a question he hadn't known how to ask and had just, unexpectedly, received the answer. Clem was a genuine delight, openly delighted by her presence in a way that was entirely without guile. He talked to her constantly when Amos wasn't within earshot, filling her in on the history of the ranch and the town, and what passed for local gossip in Harrow Creek. She learned that Amos had bought out the previous owner of the land after the man went broke, that he had a reputation for fair dealing and was respected by everyone in the territory, and that he had apparently rebuffed at least 2 previous attempts by well-meaning townspeople to arrange a marriage for him. "He wrote back to your father himself," Clem told her on the second afternoon, while they were shelling corn on the porch and Amos was in the far pasture. "Didn't have anyone do it for him. Spent about a month writing the letter, far as I could tell, rewrote it about 4 times. "How do you know that?" she asked. Clem had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "Found the drafts in the burn pile." She shook her head, smiling. "He's a good man, Miss Ramsey," Clem said, more serious now. "Best man I know. He doesn't know how to want things out loud, if you understand me." She understood him perfectly. Saturday morning arrived with a sky full of high white clouds and a cool wind out of the north that smelled like coming rain. Myrtle put on her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that set off her green eyes, and braided her hair up, and let the stubborn curls at her temples do what they would. When she came out of the bedroom, Amos was standing in the main room in a clean white shirt and dark trousers and his good boots, hat in his hands. He looked up when she appeared. He went completely still. She watched him look at her. It was the same way he'd been looking at her since the stagecoach step, that unguarded directness, but there was something more in it now. Something that had grown and deepened in 3 days of morning coffee, and quiet suppers and conversations that wandered from horses to weather to Missouri to the nature of land, and what a person owed the ground they worked. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has decided is the most important thing in his world. "You look beautiful," he said. It was simple and direct and completely free of performance, and it hit her somewhere behind the ribs with a force she hadn't quite been ready for. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady, but just barely. The wedding in Harrow Creek was small, witnessed by Clem and Dutch and half a dozen townspeople who had apparently decided the event deserved their attendance whether they'd been invited or not. The round-faced woman with the egg basket, who turned out to be named Pearl Whitmore and to be the wife of the blacksmith, stood near the front and wept cheerfully. Reverend Collins, a lean man with kind eyes and a slightly theatrical manner, performed the ceremony in front of the little church that needed painting. Myrtle said her vows clearly, looking at Amos. He said his looking at her. His voice did not shake. His eyes did not leave her face from the moment. The Reverend began to the moment he said, "You may kiss your bride," with a slightly theatrical flourish. The kiss was brief and careful, his hands coming up to her face as though she were something precious and fragile even though she was neither. And when he pulled back, his pale eyes were close and very warm, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "I am going to love this man enormously." The days that followed the wedding moved with a fullness that Myrtle hadn't expected. She had imagined frontier married life as relentlessly practical, all labor and duty, and the grinding work of keeping a household functioning in a place that wanted to take everything back. And it was work, certainly. The wash alone was a half-day enterprise. The cooking took real skill when you were working with a wood fire, and whatever the supply wagon brought in twice a month. The vegetable garden behind the house had been badly managed and needed complete rethinking. But there was also this. Amos Stone was a man who noticed things. He noticed when she had tired herself out and brought her tea without being asked. He noticed when the handle on the kitchen bucket had gotten rough and replaced it before she had a chance to get a blister. He noticed the direction of the wind in the morning and told her before she went out to hang washing whether it was a good day for it. He noticed what she liked on her plate and what she pushed to the side. He noticed everything, in fact, with an attentiveness that she realized was simply the way he was in the world. He watched. He paid attention. He had always paid attention. She thought about what her aunt had said, that she would be invisible to this man, and she almost laughed. They had established, without discussion, a kind of domestic territory. She had her room, he had his. They were married, but they were also very new to each other, and Amos appeared to be a man who understood the value of patience in all living things. He was not pushing. He was not rushing. He was, she thought, doing exactly what she'd watched him do with the bay mare. Being present and consistent and letting trust build at its own pace. She found this both admirable and, increasingly, maddening. 3 weeks into their marriage, she went out to the barn in the early evening and found him repairing a saddle by lantern light, sitting on a low stool with his legs stretched out and his hands moving through the familiar work. She sat on a hay bale nearby and watched him for a while, and the light was warm and the barn smelled of horse and leather and hay, and she said, "Amos." He said, "Did you actually want to get married, or was it something you decided you were supposed to want?" His hand slowed. He looked up at her. In the lantern light his eyes were very pale and very clear and entirely direct. "I wanted it," he said. "What did you want specifically?" He set the saddle aside and turned to face her fully. He was quiet for a moment, the way he always was when he was thinking rather than stalling. "Someone to have supper with," he said. "Someone to talk to, someone worth making this place better for." He paused. "Someone who looked back." That last one sat between them in the warm barn air. "I look back," she said. "I know," he said. "You have since the first moment." She got up off the hay bale and crossed the small space between them and sat down on the stool beside him, very close, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. He went very still, the way the bay mare had gone still just before she finally relaxed. "I'm not a skittish horse," she said quietly. He turned his head to look at her, and the smile that had been threatening at the corners of his mouth all these weeks finally, fully appeared. It transformed his face. It was extraordinary. She felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. "No," he said, soft and warm. "You're not." He reached out and tucked one of the stubborn curls back from her temple, his thumb brushing her cheekbone, and the gentleness of it was almost more than she could hold. She turned her face slightly into his hand, just slightly, and he understood because he always understood the small things. And he kissed her then, in the lantern-lit barn with the horses shifting in their stalls, properly this time, not careful and brief but warm and real and thorough. When they finally separated, she was quite pink, and he looked like a man who had just discovered something he intended to spend a great deal of time exploring. "Good evening, Mr. Stone," she said. "Good evening, Mrs. Stone," he said, and it was the first time either of them had used that name, and it landed in the center of her chest like a warm coal. October turned the territory gold and crimson, and November brought the cold down from the north, and Myrtle settled into the Stone ranch like she had grown there. She rearranged the kitchen to make better use of the space and planted a proper vegetable garden plot that would be ready by spring. She befriended Pearl Whitmore, who became a regular visitor on Thursday afternoons when Pearl's husband Luther was doing accounts at the smithy, and Pearl needed someone to talk at. Pearl talked, Myrtle listened and occasionally inserted precise observations, and they became genuinely fond of each other. She also, steadily and with great intention, learned everything about the ranch. Not because she felt obligated to be useful, though she did feel that, but because it was Amos's world and she wanted to understand it the way she understood him, from the inside out. He seemed to find this extraordinary. He was not accustomed to anyone wanting to understand the particulars of what he did. He had always worked alone in his knowledge, carrying the weight of 400 acres and 200 cattle and a horse-breeding operation inside his own head with no one to share it with. She could see what it did to him when she asked questions and meant them, when she walked the fence lines with him in the cold mornings, and he explained what he was looking at and she remembered it and brought it up 3 days later. He expanded, almost visibly. He talked more. Not a great deal more. He was not suddenly a different person, but the quantity of words he offered increased and the nature of them deepened. One morning in November, he took her out on horseback to see the full extent of the property, and they rode for most of the day through terrain that was stark and wild and magnificent. She rode well, had ridden since childhood, and he noticed this with obvious approval, not the kind of approval that was condescending, but the kind that recognized a peer. "Back pasture needs a new fence line come spring," he said, standing up in his stirrups to look across the distance. "Creek's been eroding the south bank." "How much fence?" she asked. "Quarter-mile, maybe. Could Clem and Dutch manage it with you, or would you need to hire extra hands?" He glanced at her sideways. "I could probably hire one more for a couple weeks." "What about Juan Medina?" she said. "Pearl mentioned he's a good worker and he's been looking since the cowhound spread let men go." He looked at her properly. "You've been paying attention." "I'm always paying attention," she said. "You of all people should appreciate that." He shook his head slightly, but it was the smile head shake, the one she had learned to know. He pulled his horse around to head back toward the ranch. "I'll talk to Juan," he said. She nudged her horse to fall in beside him, matching his pace, and they rode home through the afternoon light with the red rock burning around them. And she was happier than she had any factual right to expect from an arranged marriage made through letters by a father who had mostly wanted one less mouth to feed. In December, the real trouble arrived, and it came in the shape of a man named Harlan Webb. Webb was a cattle buyer from the eastern part of the territory, a man with a loud mouth and a wide hat, and a certainty about his own importance that was visible from 30 yards away. He arrived at Stone Ranch on a Wednesday morning in December with 2 men riding behind him, and a proposition that he delivered with the ease of someone who expected to be agreed with. He wanted to buy the Stone Ranch. Specifically, he wanted the south pasture and the creek land, which was the best watered section of the property, and the grazing Amos depended on for his cattle through the dry summer months. Webb had apparently been buying up land through the territory for the past 2 years, assembling a large operation by acquiring smaller ranches, often under circumstances that the surviving ranchers in the area described with tight lips and careful words. Myrtle was in the kitchen when he arrived, but she could hear the conversation through the open window perfectly well. She stayed very still and listened. Webb made his offer, which was low, and Amos said no. Webb said the offer might not be available forever, and Amos said that was fine. Webb said something then in a lower voice that she couldn't entirely make out, and the quality of the silence that followed was different from Amos's usual quiet. It was the silence of a man making a decision about how to respond to something that required restraint. "You'll want to ride back to wherever you came from," Amos said, and his voice was very even and very calm and left absolutely no room for interpretation. There was another moment, and then the sound of horses leaving. She went to the window in time to see Webb and his men riding out of the yard, and Amos standing in front of the porch watching them go, his hands loose at his sides, everything about him composed and deliberate. He came in a few minutes later and found her in the kitchen, not pretending she hadn't been listening. "What did he say to you?" she asked. He poured himself a cup of coffee and turned around and leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at her steadily. "He suggested that people who don't sell when asked sometimes find their circumstances change in ways that make selling necessary." She held his gaze. "That's a threat." "It is," he said simply. "Have others in the area had the same conversation with him?" "Tom Briley lost his ranch last spring," he said. "Fire took his barn and 2 outbuildings. He sold 3 weeks later. Word is that wasn't the only fire on property that Webb wanted." He said this flatly, not with drama, just stating what he understood to be true. "We should tell the sheriff," she said. "There's no proof of anything," he said. "Then we need to be careful." She moved to the window and looked out at the yard. "Is there anything that could catch fire that we could better protect?" He was quiet for a moment, and she turned back to find him watching her with that familiar focused attention. "You're not frightened," he said. "I didn't say that," she said. "I'm thinking instead of being frightened. There's a difference." Something moved through his expression, something deep and genuine, and he crossed the kitchen in a few strides and held her face in both hands and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that felt like everything he didn't have words for. "I'll talk to Dutch about extra watch at night," he said, "and I'll talk to some of the other ranchers. Webb's been working through this territory one property at a time. We're not the only ones who have reason to push back. Talk to Tom Briley too," she said. "Even if he's already sold, he might be willing to say something official if he knows he's not standing alone." Amos nodded slowly. "You'd make a good hand in a negotiation," he said. "I'm your wife," she said. "Which means this is my land too, and I don't intend to have anyone take it." The ranchers' meeting happened at Pearl and Luther Whitmore's house 2 weeks before Christmas, because the Smithy's main room was the largest in Harrow Creek, and because Luther, it turned out, had his own grievances against Harlan Webb. 6 ranchers came, plus Myrtle, plus Pearl, and the territory's deputy sheriff, a young man named Cal Hendricks who was earnest and somewhat overwhelmed by the scope of what he was hearing. Amos stood up and spoke with a clarity and economy that clearly surprised people who had been told he was silent. He laid out what Webb had said to him, and then Tom Briley, a weathered man of about 50 with sad eyes and a burned right hand, stood up and said what had happened to his barn, and what had happened the day before the fire when 2 strangers had been seen on his property asking questions. And then 2 other ranchers added their own experiences, and the room went very quiet with the collective weight of it. Cal Hendricks wrote everything down and promised to send a dispatch to the territorial marshal's office. He was young, but he was not timid, and he left that night with a purpose that was reassuring. Webb never came back to Stone Ranch. Whether it was Cal's dispatch, or the solidarity of the ranchers presenting a unified front, or simply the calculation that some targets were more trouble than they were worth, no one ever knew for certain. But the fire that might have come did not come, and the following spring Tom Briley, having received a fair price for his sold land from a different buyer, started a new operation 20 miles north, and Harlan Webb's name was eventually associated with a legal inquiry that resulted in him leaving the territory entirely by the following year. Myrtle took quiet satisfaction in all of this and moved on to thinking about the vegetable garden. Christmas at Stone Ranch was something she had not imagined would be special, and turned out to be the best one she could remember. She and Pearl baked pies and a sweet bread with dried apple that scented the whole house. Clem and Dutch came for Christmas dinner, and Clem brought a fiddle and played for 2 hours after the meal, and Dutch, who turned out to have a surprisingly fine singing voice, kept up a low harmony on the old carols. Amos sat beside Myrtle at the table, and she leaned against his shoulder at some point without meaning to, and he put his arm around her and she stayed there, warm and completely at ease. He gave her a gift that evening, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a small botanical book, with color plates of the plants of the Arizona territory. She sat looking at it for a long moment, understanding that he had ordered this weeks ago, that he had thought about what she would want specifically, that he had noticed she was always asking what things were when she walked the land with him. "It's wonderful," she said, with a fullness in her throat that she hoped he could hear. "It's exactly right. I thought you'd want names for everything," he said. "I always want names for everything," she said. "Then they're real." He looked at her with those clear gray eyes in the warm candlelight. "You're real," he said softly, as if this still surprised him. She reached up and touched his jaw, the rough beard she had come to love the feel of. "So are you," she said. He turned his face to press a kiss into her palm, and Clem made a pointed effort to start a very loud new song on the fiddle, and Dutch looked at the ceiling, and the fire crackled, and the night outside was cold and full of stars. Winter deepened and thinned and turned toward spring, and Myrtle discovered in early February that she was going to have a child. She told Amos on a Sunday morning, sitting across the breakfast table from him, because she was not the kind of woman who constructed elaborate moments for news that was news enough on its own. He looked at her across the table. He was very still for a moment. Then he stood up and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his and looked up at her, and there was something in his face that she had no word for because it was too large for ordinary words. It was joy and fear and wonder and fierceness all at once, and it was entirely unguarded, offered to her completely. "Are you well?" he said. His voice was low and careful. "Perfectly well," she said. "A little sick in the mornings, but Pearl says that's normal and hers was much worse." "Does Pearl know?" he asked. "Pearl guessed," she said. "She's perceptive." He held her hands and was quiet for a long moment. "A child," he said, as though he was testing the weight of the word. "In September, I think," she said. He brought her hands up and pressed them to his forehead, eyes closed, and stayed that way for a moment that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Then he looked up at her, and the thing she had been watching grow in his eyes for months was there fully now, enormous and clear and offered without reservation. "I love you," he said. It was the first time he had said it. His voice was steady and certain, as if he had known it for a long time and had simply been deciding when to say it. "I want you to know that. However this goes, whatever happens, I love you, Myrtle." She felt the tears before she decided to cry them quick and warm. "I know," she said, because she did know. She had watched the evidence of it every day for months in every quiet action and attentive gesture. "I've known for a while." She brought her hands down to cup his face. "I love you too, Amos, thoroughly and completely." He closed his eyes briefly and then opened them and stood and pulled her up and held her with a care and a tenderness that was also a kind of possession, the way a person holds something they have claimed as the center of their world. "I'm not fragile," she said into his chest. "I know," he said. "I'm just glad." Spring came in earnest, and Juan Medina joined them for the fence work, and turned out to be a fine addition to the operation. A quiet, steady man about Amos's age who knew cattle as well as any man in the territory, and who also turned out to be a remarkable hand with horses. Amos offered him a permanent position by June, and he accepted without fuss, and Stone Ranch acquired its third full-time hand. The vegetable garden was a triumph. Myrtle had reworked the soil through the late winter, and planted according to what she had learned about the territory's growing season from her botanical book, and from Pearl and from the woman at the general store. A weathered half-Mexican woman named Consuelo Ruiz, who had 40 years of desert gardening behind her, and opinions about soil that were both strong and accurate. The garden came in full and abundant by June, and Myrtle stood looking at it one morning with her hands on her growing belly, and felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost solemn. Amos appeared at her shoulder. He did that appeared without sound, not to startle her but because he moved through his world without needing to announce himself. "You're pleased with it," he said. "I'm very pleased with it," she said. "I made something grow in the desert." "You've made several things grow," he said, and she heard the warmth in it. "You're going to be sentimental," she said. "Occasionally," he agreed. She took his hand and pressed it to the curve of her belly where the child was making itself known with increasing enthusiasm. He went still the way he always went still when something moved him, and she watched his profile, the strong jaw and the pale eyes and the lines around them, and she thought about the women in Missouri who had told her she would be invisible to this man, and she thought about how completely, perfectly wrong they had been. As summer deepened, the ranch took on a new rhythm adjusted for Myrtle's condition and for the practical reality of a baby coming in September. Amos quietly rearranged things so that the heaviest work was not hers to do. He didn't make a production of it, and he didn't treat her as an invalid, but the water barrel was never empty when she went to it, and the firewood was always in, and the heaviest supply boxes came off the wagon and into the house before she had a chance to lift them. When she pointed this out, he said, "I notice what needs doing," and that was all, and she stopped arguing because she had her own work and was grateful for the help. Clem, who was transparently thrilled about the prospect of a baby in the household, made himself useful in ways that were occasionally excessive. He repaired every loose board on the porch without being asked. He built a little rocking cradle out of good pine with carved details at the headboard that were small and careful and surprisingly beautiful for a young man who spent most of his time with cattle. "Clem," she said, when he brought it in and set it in the corner of the bedroom with the air of someone presenting a prize, "this is extraordinary." He turned the color of a brick. "It's just a cradle," he said. "It's beautiful," she said. "Truly." Dutch, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, nodded once in confirmation. "Spent 3 weeks on it," he said. "Dutch," Clem said. "She should know," Dutch said simply. Myrtle looked at Clem, who was examining the ceiling. "Thank you," she said. "This baby is very lucky to have people like you." Clem got his voice back and said something about needing to see to the horses and made a rapid exit, and Dutch followed with the ghost of a smile, and Myrtle stood in her bedroom with the pine cradle in the corner and the new curtains on the window and the botanical book on the shelf, and felt the extraordinary fullness of a life that had exceeded every expectation she arrived with. September arrived with a change in the air, and a baby who did not intend to wait. Myrtle's labor began in the early morning of the 7th of September, 1879, and Pearl Whitmore had been alerted and arrived within 2 hours, brisk and capable and completely unruffled, because Pearl had been through this with her own 2 children and knew exactly what needed to happen. Amos was banished to the front porch with absolutely no argument from Myrtle's end, which was a departure from her usual preference for including him in everything, but which was simply the practical nature of the situation. He sat on the porch for 7 hours in the September sunshine, and she heard him out there, not pacing, because he was not a man who paced, but she heard the intermittent sound of wood being split with more force than strictly necessary, and she found that oddly comforting. The baby arrived in the early afternoon. He was a boy, solid and loud, with a full set of opinions about the world that he communicated at considerable volume from the first moment. Pearl cleaned him up and wrapped him and brought him to Myrtle, who was tired in every muscle and completely, overwhelmingly alive. Pearl went to the door and called for Amos. He came through the door and across the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she put the baby in his arms. He held the boy with the careful attentiveness he brought to everything precious, looking down at him with an expression that was beyond any category she had a name for. The baby blinked up at him with the unfocused dark eyes of the newborn. "Hello," Amos said to him, quietly, just that. "Hello, the way you greet someone you've been waiting for." Myrtle watched her husband hold their son and felt a love so large it was almost frightening in its size. "We need a name," she said. He looked up at her. "I was thinking about that. And my father was called Edmund," he said. "I never knew him well. He died when I was young, but he was a good man from what I was told." "Edmund Stone," she said, testing it. "We'll call him Eddie." He looked down at the baby again. "Eddie," he said softly. The baby made a sound that was not precisely agreement but was the direction of agreement. Pearl made herself invisible in the corner, which was a skill she had developed for exactly these kinds of moments. The months after Eddie's arrival were tiring and wonderful and full of the specific chaos of a new life demanding acknowledgement at all hours. Myrtle had not known she could function on so little sleep, and she was grudgingly impressed by herself. Amos, who had never once suggested that the nighttime business of babies was exclusively her responsibility, got up more nights than she counted. She would wake to find the baby already settled, and Amos coming back to bed with the calm competence of a man who had simply assessed a situation and addressed it. "You didn't have to get up," she told him one morning, when she had finally managed 4 consecutive hours of sleep. He was awake, he said, as if this answered everything. Most fathers in this territory would say that's the wife's concern. He looked at her across the table. I'm not most men in this territory, he said. No, she agreed. You are decidedly not. Eddie at 3 months was a cheerful, curious infant who had apparently inherited his mother's green eyes and his father's expression of focused attentiveness, which meant he spent a great deal of time staring very seriously at whatever was in front of him, as if preparing a thorough assessment. He was also inclined to produce opinions about the situation at considerable volume, which clearly came from a combination of both parents. Clem was absolutely besotted. He held Eddie at every available opportunity, with the concentration of someone who had been handed something both wonderful and terrifying. Dutch was more circumspect but could be caught, when he thought no one was watching, making small faces at the baby that were entirely undignified and entirely effective. Juan Medina, who had 3 children of his own in town, gave the baby a small carved wooden horse on his first-month anniversary, with a care for the craft that matched the quality of the work. Myrtle put it on the shelf next to the botanical book, between the 2 windows with the clean curtains. The year rounded into winter again, and then to spring, and the baby grew into a toddler who terrorized the chicken yard with great enthusiasm. Stone Ranch expanded its horse operation in the spring of 1880, with Amos taking on a contract to supply horses to a freighting company in Tucson, which meant carefully selecting and training animals that needed to be both strong and reliable. It was good work, and it stretched the operation, and it required everything Amos was best at. Myrtle found herself increasingly involved in the business side of the ranch, which had previously existed entirely in Amos's head. She set up a proper ledger system, organized the supply orders, tracked the horse sales and the cattle sales and the expenses against them, and produced for the first time in the ranch's history a clear accounting of what it made and spent and what that meant for the future. When she presented Amos with the first full year's accounting in the spring of 1880, with all the numbers laid out plainly and the forward projections she had worked out based on the Tucson contract and the expected cattle prices, he went through it slowly and carefully and then looked up at her. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My uncle kept books for a trading company," she said. "I spent 2 summers working with him when I was 16. He looked at her with an expression she knew well by now, that particular quality of attention that meant he was fitting a new piece into the picture he kept building of her. "I should have been doing this from the start," he said, meaning the accounting, and she heard in it the broader admission that he had been running a 400-acre operation on instinct and experience and no small amount of luck. "You can start now," she said. "We can start now," he corrected, and the partnership that had been building from the first morning she had brought him coffee was made fully explicit in 2 words. The summer of 1880 brought a drought that tested everyone in the territory. The creek dropped by half and the back pasture grasses went dry by July, and Amos made the decision to move the main cattle herd to the northern section of the property, where there was better cover and a spring that hadn't failed yet. It was a hard few weeks of work, and the heat was punishing. Myrtle managed the household through it with a practical efficiency that she was quietly proud of. She renegotiated the water schedule with Consuelo Ruiz's advice, kept the vegetable garden alive on minimum water, and organized the cooking for the hired hands during the long drives in a way that kept everyone fed and fueled without wasting anything. One evening in the middle of the worst of the heat, she and Amos sat on the porch after Eddie had been put to bed and watched the last light die in the west, and the stars come out with that extraordinary desert brilliance. The heat of the day was still in the air, but the night was cooling slowly toward bearable. He had barely spoken all day. The work had been heavy and the decisions continuous, and she knew him well enough now to understand that this particular quiet was not distance, but the kind of exhaustion that goes too deep for words. She moved her chair next to his and took his hand and held it, not saying anything, just being there. He turned his head to look at her in the dark, and she felt rather than saw his expression. "There are days it's very hard," he said after a while. I know, she said. And then I come back to the porch and you're here, he said, and everything is worth it again. She held his hand more firmly. You could have just told me that directly, she said, instead of spending this whole evening looking tired and saying nothing. I was getting to it, he said. You always get to it, she said. Eventually. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, and they sat like that until the stars were full overhead and the coyotes started up their conversation somewhere in the distance. The drought broke in late August with a storm that came in from the southwest and dropped rain for 3 consecutive days. Eddie stood on the porch in the warm rain on the second day, 18 months old, and absolutely convinced this was the most important thing that had ever happened to him, laughing at the sky with his father standing behind him in the doorway watching with that rare full smile that made him unrecognizable to anyone who had only met the silent rancher. Myrtle stood beside Amos and leaned into his side, and he put his arm around her, and she thought about what it meant to know a person. She had arrived with 2 trunks and a hat box and a set of warnings that had proven entirely wrong, and she had found a man who had been waiting with a patience that matched his character to be truly known, and who looked at her still, 2 years on, with that same unguarded attention he had fixed on her the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. "What are you thinking?" he asked. He always asked that when she was quiet, which she appreciated because she knew now that for him it was the most important question. "That I was warned about you," she said. "Were you?" "Extensively," she said. "I was told you would ignore me." He made a sound that was as close to a laugh as he usually got. "Who told you that?" "Everyone I knew," she said. "My aunt, the postmaster's wife, my mother." He was quiet for a moment. And was there any moment when that seemed accurate? She thought about the livery post and the 3 hours early and the new curtains and the clean windows and the morning coffee becoming a ritual and every small attentive thing he had done from the first day, and the way he had never, not once, looked away from her. "Not one," she said. He pressed his mouth to her hair. "Good," he said. The following spring, 1881, brought changes to Harrow Creek. The town was growing with the railroad extension, moving through the territory and bringing new people and new commerce and new trouble in roughly equal measure. The Stone Ranch was in a better position than it had ever been financially. The horse contract with the Tucson Company had proved the value of the breeding operation, and Amos had taken on 2 more, one with a mining company that needed reliable pack animals, and one with the Territorial Postal Service, which needed horses that could be ridden hard and recovered quickly. Myrtle was expecting their second child by summer, and she was feeling well and energetically optimistic about everything, which she suspected had as much to do with the state of her life in general as with her physical condition. She was happy, genuinely, solidly, sustainably happy. She had not expected that to be the outcome of an arrangement made through careful letters and a sum of money, but she had built it with intention and it had been built with her, and it was real. Pearl Whitmore came to Thursday tea looking flustered, which was unusual for Pearl, who faced most things with cheerful directness. "There's talk in town," Pearl said, putting down her cup. "About a woman who's come in on the stage, Eastern woman from Denver apparently. Says she's looking to invest in the territory." Pearl paused. "She's been asking about Stone Ranch specifically, asking who owns it, how large it is, what the operation looks like." Myrtle looked at her calmly. "What kind of investment?" "Land, seems like. She's apparently connected to some Denver money that's been buying up Arizona territory land for speculation." Myrtle set down her own cup and thought about this. "Is she connected to Webb?" Webb was gone from the territory, but the inquiry that followed him had rattled loose several other names. "Not that anyone knows," Pearl said. "But Myrtle," she asked specifically, "by name?" Myrtle nodded slowly. "I'll mention it to Amos," she said, "and I'll go into town tomorrow and introduce myself to this woman." Pearl blinked. "You'll introduce yourself?" "Yes," Myrtle said. "I prefer to know what something is rather than speculate about it." The Denver woman was named Helena Cross, and she was not what Myrtle had been bracing for. She was about 40, composed and intelligent, with the bearing of someone who had built her own competence from scratch in a world that didn't make it easy. She was staying at the Harrow Creek Hotel, a modest establishment with ambitions above its actual quality, and she received Myrtle in the small sitting room off the lobby with the cautious courtesy of a woman accustomed to people approaching her with agendas. Myrtle sat down across from her and said, "I'm Myrtle Stone. My husband owns Stone Ranch. I heard you've been asking about it." Helena Cross looked at her steadily. "You're direct," she said. "It saves time," Myrtle said. A small smile appeared. "So it does." She folded her hands. "I have investment clients who are interested in land opportunities in this territory. Stone Ranch is a well-run operation by all accounts, with water rights and good breeding stock. I was looking into whether it might be available for partnership or purchase." "It's not available for purchase," Myrtle said pleasantly. "We're not interested in selling. Partnership. That would depend considerably on the terms and the nature of the partnership," Myrtle said. "But we're also managing our growth without outside capital at the moment, and we prefer it that way." She met the woman's eyes. "However, if you're genuinely looking for sound operations in this territory to recommend to your investors, I could point you towards several. There are good people here who could use that kind of backing." Helena Cross was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're not what I expected the wife of a rancher out here to be." "No," Myrtle said, "I generally am not." The Denver woman left Harrow Creek a week later without acquiring any land, but not before having a long conversation with Tom Briley about his new operation to the north. She sent Myrtle a short letter 3 weeks later from Denver, informing her that her clients had made an investment in the Briley operation and thanking her for the introduction. Tom Briley sent his own letter a week after that, calling Myrtle a marvel, which she took in stride. She told Amos the whole story one evening, and he listened to it with his full attention, and when she finished, he shook his head very slightly with that expression of constant, interested discovery that she had come to understand was simply how he felt about her. "You negotiate like a rancher," he said. "I negotiate like myself," she said, "which happens to be effective." "It does," he agreed. He reached across the table and took her hand. "The ranch is ours. No one is ever taking it." "No," she said, squeezing his hand. "They are not." The second baby arrived in August of 1881, a girl this time, delivered again by Pearl with an efficiency born of practice. She was small and fair-haired with her father's gray eyes, and she cried for about 3 minutes, and then looked around the room with an expression of focused assessment that made Pearl say, "Lord, she's going to be exactly like her mother." They named her Clara after Myrtle's mother, and she was placed in the pine cradle that Clem had built, and she looked up at the carved headboard with those serious gray eyes and seemed to find it satisfactory. Amos held Clara the evening of her first day and sat with her by the window in the fading light, and Eddie, who was approaching 2 years old with opinions about everything, climbed up onto the chair beside him and looked at his sister with the expression of someone who had not entirely decided how to feel about this development. "Baby," Eddie said, because that was his current vocabulary for her. "Clara," Amos said. "Baby Clara," Eddie said, with the magnanimity of someone offering a compromise. Myrtle, watching from the doorway with a cup of tea, thought she would carry this particular picture with her for the rest of her life. The lamplight and the window, and her husband with their daughter, and their son working out his position in the new order of things, and the whole weight of what they had built together contained in that small, warm room. She had arrived with 2 trunks and a hat box. She had built this. The ranch continued to grow and flourish in the years that followed, though grow was not always the right word, because Amos was a man who understood the difference between expansion and overextension, and preferred to do things well over doing them largely. The horse operation became the most consistently profitable part of the business, and by 1882, the Stone Ranch horses were known through the territory for their quality and reliability. Juan Medina was a full partner in the horse operation by then, with a formal arrangement that recognized his contribution and gave him a genuine stake in the outcome. Clem Farrow, who had been 20 when Myrtle arrived, was 25 and had grown into a skilled hand with a wide smile and a still irrepressible manner, and a young woman in Harrow Creek named Alma who clearly intended to marry him within the year. Dutch Pharaoh said nothing about his own romantic life ever, which was consistent with his general approach to personal information, but Myrtle had observed enough to suspect a situation developing with Consuelo Ruiz's niece, a practical young woman named Rosa who worked at the general store, and who seemed entirely unimpressed by Dutch, in a way that suggested she was very impressed indeed. Pearl Whitmore remained her closest friend, and Thursday tea continued to be the reliable pivot of her social week. They talked about everything. The town, the territory, the changes coming with the railroad and what those changes would mean for people who had built their lives out here in the time when it was harder and wilder. They talked about their children and their husbands and the particular nature of making a life in a place that was still figuring out its own rules. One Thursday Pearl said, "Do you ever think about Missouri?" Myrtle considered this honestly. "Not often," she said. "I think about my mother sometimes, my brother. Do you miss it?" "No," she said, and it was simply true. "I miss the people I carry from there, but I don't miss the place." She looked out the window at the October hills. "This is my place." Pearl nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had hoped for exactly this answer. "Amos still looks at you," Pearl said then with a sideways expression. "In town, at the Saturday market. He watches you the way he did when you got off that stage." Myrtle smiled. "I know. It's remarkable," Pearl said. "Most men stop paying that kind of attention after the first year. Luther's lovely, but I could probably walk through the smithy on fire and he'd ask me to pass the tongs." "Amos pays attention to everything he cares about," Myrtle said. "He always has. I just happen to be the thing he cares about most." Pearl said with great feeling, "Lord, what a thing." In the autumn of 1882, Amos built an addition onto the house. He had been talking about it since Eddie was born, a proper separate room for the children with 2 built-in beds and a small window looking out at the cottonwoods along the creek, and he got it done in October with help from Dutch and Juan over 2 weekends and a few long evenings after the regular work. He was meticulous about it, fitting each piece of wood with the same care he brought to everything. Myrtle watched the framing go up one evening and felt that the house had always known it was going to grow. The original structure had been built for one man living alone, and it had waited, and now it was becoming what it was supposed to be all along. She said something like that to Amos later, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I thought about that when I built it, that there was room for more." "You thought about having a family when you built it." "I thought about wanting one," he said. "I didn't know if I'd get there." She put her arm around him and he put his arm around her, and they stood looking at the framing of the new room in the evening light. "You got there," she said. "We got there," he said. By the end of 1882, the addition was finished. Eddie and Clara were installed in their new room with considerable ceremony and Eddie's opinions about the window views, and the main bedroom became fully and properly the private world of Amos and Myrtle Stone, which was as it should have been from the start, and which both of them agreed had been worth the patience. The new year began well. The horse contract with the Postal Service was renewed for a 3rd year with an expanded order. The cattle herd was healthy, and the calf crop in spring was strong. Juan Medina's family moved out to the ranch, with a proper house of their own at the east end of the property that Amos had planned and Juan had helped build, and having children on the property for Eddie and Clara to grow up around was something Myrtle found deeply satisfying. She wrote to her mother that spring. They had corresponded occasionally through the years, careful letters that navigated around the complicated feelings of separation, but this letter she wrote with an openness she hadn't managed before. She described the ranch and the children and Amos, trying to capture in words what she had built out of an arrangement that her mother had wept over. She described the morning coffee ritual, the way he watched for things that needed doing and did them, the full smile that appeared rarely and was therefore extraordinary when it did. She described the first time he had said he loved her, crouching beside her chair with her hands pressed to his forehead. She described the way he had looked at her stepping off the stagecoach and had not, in 4 years, stopped looking. Her mother's letter in return took 6 weeks to arrive. It was shorter than usual and it said, "I cried. Not the way I cried when you left. Better. I am glad the world surprised you." Myrtle read it at the kitchen table and held it for a long time. The summer of 1883 brought Clem's wedding to Alma, which was conducted with great enthusiasm, and a reception at the Stone Ranch that lasted until well past dark and involved Pearl's pies and Clem's own fiddle played by Dutch, who was competent but not gifted, and real dancing in the yard to the general satisfaction of everyone. Myrtle danced with Amos, which he did with a quiet competence that surprised her every time it shouldn't have, and Eddie fell asleep under the table at approximately 9 o'clock and had to be carried to bed by his father, which Clara reported in the morning with the informational precision of a nearly 2-year-old. It was a good summer, a very good summer. Later that year, Myrtle discovered she was expecting a third child, which arrived in the spring of 1884 in the efficient and unceremonious fashion of a third birth attended by the now expert Pearl Whitmore. Another boy, dark-haired and already louder than Eddie had been at the same age, which was a prospect that gave both parents a moment of private reflection. They named him James, for no particular reason other than that it suited him from the first moment. Eddie was 5 by then, which was old enough to have fully developed opinions about the baby and most other things, and he received James with the cautious interest of someone who had already been through this once and understood the long-term implications. Clara, who at nearly 3 was both her father's daughter in her attentiveness and her mother's in her directness, took one long look at James and announced, "Mine," with a firmness that suggested she intended to be involved in his upbringing whether anyone asked her to be or not. Amos, holding James for the first time in the low evening light, looked across at Myrtle in the bed where she was exhausted and satisfied and watching him with every bit of the attention she always gave him. 3, he said. 3, she confirmed. House might need another addition, he said. She laughed, which was the best sound she had made all day. Build it, she said. He looked down at James with that same quality of recognition he had given each of their children in the first hour of their lives, that steady, full presence that said, "I see you. You are real. You are mine to protect." "Hello," he said to James, just that, the same word he had given each of them. The word that contained everything. James seemed to find this acceptable and went to sleep. The years on Stone Ranch moved with the rhythm of seasons and work, and the small and significant events of a family living deeply in a place that was theirs. The addition was built, and the children grew into it, and the horse operation became something people talked about in Tucson and beyond. Amos's name meant quality in 3 territories by 1885, which he acknowledged with characteristic brevity, and continued to do the work at exactly the standard he had always maintained. Myrtle was involved in every aspect of it, the ledgers and the supply negotiations, and the relationships with the buyers and the ongoing management of the household. That was never small work, no matter how people talked about it as if it were. She was known in Harrow Creek and beyond as a woman of unusual competence and directness, which pleased her in a way she didn't bother to be modest about. She turned 30 in September of 1885, and Amos organized something she had not seen coming. She came home from a Thursday afternoon at Pearl's to find the ranch yard populated with people. The Farrows, Clem with Alma, who was expecting their first child, Dutch, who had indeed married Rosa and looked faintly bewildered by his own contentment, the Medina family, Pearl and Luther, Reverend Collins, who happened to be in the territory, Consuelo Ruiz with opinions about everything, and a magnificent cake. The children were dressed in their best, and had clearly been rehearsed in something, because they presented her with a bunch of wildflowers in unison with the coordinated chaos of children who had been told what to do and mostly remembered it. Amos was standing on the porch watching her come through the gate and see all of it, and he looked like a man who was satisfied with what he had arranged, and also like a man who was looking at his wife the way he had always looked at her, with that complete and steady attention, finding her across every room and every yard and every distance between them. She walked up to him and looked up at him in the late afternoon light. "You organized this," she said. "I had help," he said. "You always say you had help when you did most of it yourself," she said. "I had essential help," he said. "The children were very enthusiastic about the flowers." "They were excellent," she said. "The flowers are excellent." He looked at her, just looked at her with all of it there in his eyes, the 5 years and the children and the land and the morning coffee and the barn in lantern light, and the first time he'd said he loved her, and every evening since on the porch watching the stars. "Happy birthday, Myrtle," he said. She stood on the tips of her boots and kissed him right there in front of everyone, which made Clem produce a noise of celebration. And Clara, who was 4 and had strong opinions about public demonstrations of affection, said "Papa, Mama," in a tone of resigned acceptance. And Eddie at 6 giggled and James at 1 seemed to find the whole event worth staying awake for. Pearl wiped her eyes. She always wiped her eyes. The party lasted all evening, and Amos danced with Myrtle in the yard, while Dutch played the fiddle better than he had at Clem's wedding, having apparently practiced in the interim, and the lanterns made the yard warm and golden, and the sky above the Arizona territory was the kind of sky that made people understand why anyone would come to such a hard and beautiful place and choose to stay. Later, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the yard was quiet, she and Amos sat on the porch in the dark. She had her feet up on the porch rail and a cup of tea, and the night air was cool the way September nights in the territory could be, carrying the first hint of the autumn to come. He sat beside her, and they were quiet together in the way they had been quiet together from the beginning, the comfortable silence of 2 people who had built their world jointly and knew every board and beam of it. "Do you remember what you said to me the first day?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "I speak when there's something worth saying." "Yes," she said. "Do you remember what you said back?" "I said I supposed we'd find out if I qualified," she said. He turned his head to look at her. "You qualified," he said. She smiled into the dark. "I know," she said. "You made that very clear." "Did I?" "From the first moment," she said. "You were standing at the livery post watching the stage before it even arrived. They told me you'd ignore me." She shook her head. "You looked at me and you did not stop." He reached over and took her hand. "No," he said, "I didn't." "Why?" she asked, the question she had never quite asked directly. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was finding the right words. "I'd read your father's letters about you," he said. They were practical letters describing your abilities and your character, the way someone describes a practical arrangement. But the way he described you, even through that practical language, I could see someone real, someone who thought and who worked and who looked at the world directly. He turned her hand over in his. "And then you stepped down from that stage and you looked around and you saw me standing there and you came straight across the road and looked me in the eye. No performance, no nerves, just you." He paused. "I had spent 30 years in a territory full of people who mostly looked past me, and then there you were, looking right at me. And I thought, that is someone I want to look at for the rest of my life." The night was very quiet around them. "Amos Stone," she said softly. "Myrtle Stone," he said. She moved closer to him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they sat on the porch of the house they had built together, in the life they had built together, in the Arizona territory in 1885, with their 3 children asleep inside, and the horses quiet in the corral and the creek running somewhere in the dark distance, and the stars overhead so numerous and so brilliant that they seemed like a personal statement from the universe about the value of looking up. She thought about the stagecoach and the 2 trunks and the hat box and the warnings and the woman she had been when she arrived, braced for invisibility, and already deciding she would not accept it. She thought about the man at the livery post who had watched her come across the road with an expression she had spent months learning the language of and was now fluent in. She thought about all the small things and the large things and the morning coffee and the new curtains and the barn in lantern light and Eddie's hello and Clara's serious gray eyes and James's extraordinary volume. She thought about what her aunt had said. "You'll be living like a ghost out there." She pressed closer to Amos and felt his arm tighten around her. She was the most present she had ever been in her life. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. She looked out at the dark territory and felt the full weight of everything she had built and been given and earned and made, and she said with complete honesty and not a shadow of qualification, profoundly. He kissed her temple. "Good," he said. And they stayed on the porch until the stars had moved halfway across the sky and the night had grown properly cold. And then they went inside, into the clean, warm house with the braided rugs and the Dutch oven and the botanical book on the shelf and the pine cradle put away now, but kept carefully in the corner of the children's room, and the curtains on the windows that had been new once and had now softened with years of light, and washing into something that simply looked like home. The ranch would continue to grow, and the children would continue to grow, and the territory would continue to change around them, with the railroad and the new settlers and the slow, complicated, imperfect process of a place becoming something more organized and settled than it had been. There would be more good years and some hard ones, and the ordinary difficulties of land and weather, and the work of keeping a family and a business functioning through whatever the world brought. But Amos Stone would go on watching Myrtle Stone with that same steady, unguarded attention he had given her from the first moment she stepped off the stage. At every Saturday market and every evening meal and every morning when she handed him coffee and their fingers came close, he would watch her walk through his world, and he would never stop finding it extraordinary that she was in it, and she would look back, always directly and fully, because she had always looked back. That was the thing the women in Missouri had gotten so completely wrong. They had said he would look past her. They had said she would disappear inside his silence. What Amos Stone had actually done, from the moment Myrtle Ramsey stepped down into the Arizona sun and walked straight across the road toward him, was see her more completely and more continuously than anyone ever had. And she had done the same for him. And that, in the end, was everything.